Good morning and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be discussing health and safety in offshore renewables. The development of offshore renewables and offshore renewable energy projects poses unique health and safety challenges. Today, we're going to discuss health and safety legislation that applies to offshore wind, preparing for compliance, including feedback from the HSA's inspection campaign of onshore wind in 2023, and bespoke guidance for managing health and safety risks. I'm Jay Satin, a partner in the Planning, Environmental and Health and Safety team at MHC, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm joined by Deirdre McKeon, who is a Health and Safety Advisor at RWE Renewables Ireland, the offshore division. Deirdre has 25 years experience in HSC in the construction, civil engineering and quarrying sectors, and specifically 3 years experience in the offshore sector. Deirdre is currently chair of Phase 1 HSE Offshore Subgroup, which is a wind energy island working group. I'm also joined by Greg Beechinor, who is a senior inspector with the Health and Safety Authority, where he leads the Utilities, Waste and Engineering Unit. Greg's unit oversees a broad regulatory mandate, including occupational safety in renewable energy generation and storage, such as offshore wind, as well as ensuring compliance across the wider utilities and waste sectors. With extensive experience in regulatory practice, Greg plays an important role in shaping the HSA's approach to emerging technologies. Lastly, we're also joined by David Foy, an associate in the Planning, Environmental and Health and Safety team at MHC. David advises employers, including those in the energy industry, on all aspects of their health and safety system. He also helps clients respond to incidents and investigations. We have a lot to cover today, and we're looking to speak for around 50 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. The webinar qualifies for 1 hour general CPD. To retrieve your CPD certificate, please complete our survey, which will be shared at the end of the session. Upon completion of the survey, you'll be directed to an online form, which will allow you to receive your CPD certificate directly to your inbox. The first question for the session today is going to go to yourself, David. Could you please give an overview of where offshore renewables are currently at in Ireland and some of the key issues that developers and contractors should be aware of?
Thanks, Jay, and good morning to everybody online. I just apologize, first of all, I have a bit of a seasonal bug, so I'm hoping that my voice will hold up, but I think we should be good. Thanks for that question. As we all know, health and safety law doesn't change very much. So I think we're currently maybe in exciting times in that regard, with many offshore wind projects planned to be constructed off the Irish coast over the next 10 to 15 years and beyond that. But only one offshore wind farm has ever been constructed in Ireland, that being Bank 1, which was constructed off the County Wicklow coast over 20 years ago in around 2003 and 2004. Incredibly, no offshore wind projects have been commenced since then, despite Ireland being recognised as having huge potential for offshore wind. Planning applications have been lodged last year and this year, including an application for the decommissioning of Bank 1. So Ireland effectively has zero gigawatts of offshore wind currently. The government's climate action plan does include a commitment by the government to develop at least 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That is an ambitious target, given that we're starting from a base of zero and we're already in 2025. But as I said, planning applications have been submitted for a number of offshore wind developments, such as Codling Wind Park, which will have generating capacity of 1.3 gigawatts, and Dublin Array, which will have generating capacity of 824 megawatts. Together alone, those two projects will provide over half the 2030 target. Applications for other offshore wind projects have also been lodged, and I think the combined total is about 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind power. So we will be expecting, a lot of development in this area over the next number of years. The auction process for ORE's 2.1 ton NUA is also expected to commence soon. So that'll lead to further offshore wind projects being developed off the southeast coast. And at the heart of all of these projects is health and safety of the workers who will be delivering them, and in what is a very challenging physical environment, being offshore. Um, of course, health and safety is a key consideration from the initial design stage of a project, with the responsibility for health and safety resting with the PSDP. And so, it should be built into plans before an application for permission is ever even submitted. And then, of course, before construction works begin, the PSCS must develop a health and safety plan for the construction stage. And it's important to bear in mind that even when construction works are complete and a project is commissioned, it continues to be a workplace and subject to health and safety laws. So things like the construction regulations can apply if any maintenance and repair works are being carried out during the operational stage, and of course at decommissioning as well. So the key to health and safety in offshore wind is understanding the risks that are involved. And statistics prepared by the International Marine Contractors Association, also known as the IMCA, show that some of the main hazards or causes of lost time incidents in offshore workplaces internationally in 2024 were line of fire incidents, transfer of personnel from ships to offshore structures, and working in enclosed spaces such as within wind turbine towers. So, for example, I think, I don't know the science behind it specifically, but I believe that in certain offshore areas, turbines might lead to a buildup of gas within turbine towers. And when workers are working in there, they're exposed to potential gases and that. And it's all of these risks that really need to be assessed and for people to be aware of them. So the IMCA statistics cover all types of offshore works, not just wind development, and they are based on information provided by almost 200 contractors and are based on over 549 million hours of offshore works in 2024. So they are a very useful resource. They reported two offshore fatalities in 2024, one related to a line of fire accident and the other accident occurred at an oil rig site. And this number of fatalities is just a third of the number of fatalities in previous years. So the guidance is proven to be effective in reducing the number of fatalities and casualties in offshore works. Total lost time injury frequency rate remained unchanged from 2023 to 2024 at 0.3 injuries per 1 million hours worked. And the total recordable injury rate for 2024 rose very slightly to 1.1, having previously been at 1.07 in 2023. So interestingly, the IMCA statistics suggest that offshore construction is safer than onshore construction in terms of both injury and fatality rates, especially offshore operations. Although statistically, offshore is higher risk than, say, manufacturing, which would benefit from a more controlled environment. So the regulation of health and safety in offshore wind is clearly very important to avoid fatalities and serious accidents. The main applicable health and safety laws currently enforced in Ireland are the 2005 Act, the construction regulations, and the general application regulations. But earlier this year, the government enacted the Marine Shipping Investigation of Marine Accidents Act 2025. It aims to enhance Ireland's maritime safety regime and to prevent recurrence of marine accidents. So the background to this is that since 2002, the investigation of marine accidents has been performed by a part-time independent body known as the Marine Casualty Investigation Board, or the MCIB. But following an independent review back in 2021, it was recommended that marine casualty investigation in Ireland should take on a full-time approach. This is in line with international best practice and mirrors existing Irish practice in aviation and in railway accident investigations. So to implement this recommendation, the government enacted the 2025 Act in April of this year. Parts of the Act were commenced on the 1st of June, but most of its provisions are still waiting to be commenced. The Act provides for the establishment of a Marine Accident Investigation Unit, known as the MIAU, within the Department of Transport. And the MIAU will replace the existing board, the MCIB, as the permanent body responsible for marine accident investigation. And the Act also gives the Minister for Transport the power to make regulations to cater for newer types of vessels being used in the offshore service sector and the carriage of industrial personnel on those vessels. So essentially, to operate in the Irish offshore wind sector, all offshore service vessels will be required to hold a safety certificate known as an Industrial Personnel Safety Certificate, confirming the vessel meets a specific safety criteria which will be set out in regulations that the Minister will have to adopt under the Act. So developers and contractors of offshore wind should ensure before commencing any works that they have access to certified offshore service vessels. And the operators of the vessels should also ensure that they hold the valid safety certification required to carry out offshore works. One of the primary obligations under the 2025 Act is the reporting of marine casualties and marine accidents. So, in broad terms, a marine casualty is an event connected with the operation of a ship that results in death or serious injury to a person, or to man overboard situations, or to material damage to a ship, or material damage to marine infrastructure or to the environment. A marine incident, on the other hand, then is an event connected to the operations of a ship that endangered the safety of a ship or a person or the environment. So no actual damage or harm need occur for something to be classed as a marine incident. Um, the reporting obligation rests with the master of a ship or the most senior officer. All marine casualties and marine incidents must be firstly notified to the MIAU as soon as practicable after they occur. And the notification to the MIAU must include certain details such as the name and description of the ship, its position in the waters, the number of persons on board, the most accurate and an accurate summary of the marine incident itself. And the notification must then be followed by a report with further details. So failure to report a marine accident or casualty, it's an offence and it carries fines of up to €500,000 and or 5 years imprisonment. So it is very important that developers or contractors are aware of their obligations under it. Um, but although those penalties exist, the role of the MIAU is to investigate very serious marine casualties and incidents. So the purpose of an investigation is just to establish the cause of the casualty or the incident and to make safety recommendations. The process isn't designed to or intended to attribute blame or fault. Rather, the aim of it really is to improve health and safety in offshore. MIAU investigators do have wide powers of investigation. So, for example, they'll be able to detain a ship or issue directions to prevent access to a ship or to a site or whatever other object might be involved in an accident for as long as is considered necessary. But having said that, the MIAU, it doesn't apply to events otherwise than as connected with the ship. So it won't replace the role of the Health and Safety Authority, which is the competent authority for offshore workplaces and health and safety. So that concludes, I suppose, an overview of where offshore renewables is currently at, and there's going to be a lot of activity in the years ahead.
Thanks very much, David, for that very helpful overview. And if we could move next to yourself, Greg. So, has the HSA considered whether there might be any gaps in the legislation that should be addressed by government to specifically target offshore workplaces?
Thanks, Jay, for the question, and thanks for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So just to start, Jay, before I come to your question, I want to give some context around how occupational safety and health is regulated here in Ireland. So it all starts with our 2005 Act, and the Act sets out the responsibilities for employers, employees, and others to ensure workplace safety. The Act is supported by various regulations, and again, it needs a bit more detail. I think it's probably useful for the attendees this morning. Particularly, I'm going to go look at the construction regulations, very relevant to the offshore wind sector, particularly in construction decommissioning works, and gen application regulations, which, as the name suggests, they're universally applied across all sectors. Suppose the offshore wind sector is no different to the majority of sectors here in Ireland because there's no specific offshore wind regulations in Ireland. And this is not, I suppose, abnormal because many sectors don't have specific regulations. The only sectors that really have specific regulations is the quarry regulations, the construction regulations, and the offshore extraction industry. So if I want to come back, I suppose, to that question you posed, Jay, I suppose we don't really see gaps per se in relation to the offshore sector. We do note there is challenges for the sector with the current regulations, and we are working with the sector to address those challenges. So if I could just step forward onto our next slide, we will look at the Act. I want to give a bit more of an overview for some of the attendees who mightn't be as familiar with the Act. So the Act sets out clear duties for employers, employees, and others involved in workplace activities. The employers have legal obligation to safeguard the safety, health, and welfare of all employees as far as reasonably practicable, which means taking proactive measures to eliminate and minimize risk. The employer's duties include conducting thorough risk assessments to identify the hazards, to eliminate the risk posed by those hazards where they can, or apply control measures to manage the risk posed by those hazards. There's also a requirement in the Act to have safety statements, and this again applies to all workplaces where employers need to have a documented safety statement in order to manage health and safety at the workplace. Importantly, the employer's responsibility is not limited to employees. it also extends to contractors, visitors, and any other individual who may be affected by the workplace activity. So, for example, if a member of the public was to come into your workplace and were to suffer an injury at your workplace, the employer has a responsibility to ensure that accident does not occur. The Act also gives responsibilities for employees. So employees have duties, and that's to include cooperating with their employer, not being intoxicated in the workplace, not engaging in improper conduct or other behaviours, attend training. So I'd encourage everyone here who are working to be familiar with what your duties are under the Act as an employee. So compliance with the Act is not really just about meeting legal requirements. Of course, it's about legal requirements, but we find in workplaces where we foster that safety culture in organisations, we see significant reduction in lost time or injuries, and we see also the greater well-being within those organisations. So we'll encourage employers to go beyond just compliance and be really fostering that safety culture within. So on the next slide, we're going to go a step further, and we're going to look at how this Act applies to the offshore environment. So if you look at the 2005 Act, it's got a very broad definition for workplaces. So it includes vessels, it includes temporary structures, it includes mobile structures. And it's this broad definition of workplaces which makes the Act applicable to the offshore environment. So the 2005 Act applies right out to the economic exclusion zone. So we consider so under the Act, these R locations are legally considered workplaces, meaning the statutory health and safety requirements apply. So while we realize for the offshore sector that many workers will be coming probably from continental Europe, those workers are coming to work in an Irish jurisdiction, so they have to comply with the Irish regulations. And I'll get into some details, particularly around the construction regulations, around some of those provisions that are unique here to Ireland and also our colleagues in the UK. And employers need to ensure those workers coming into the Irish workplace that they comply fully with those requirements. So when we look at offshore environments, there's some unique challenges to the offshore environments, and employers involved in the offshore wind activities must take a comprehensive approach to managing risks. So here I just mentioned a couple of hazards specific to the offshore environment, particularly the marine and weather hazards. So the offshore environment is very unpredictable with risk of storms, sea swells, and extreme conditions. So employers must plan for safe operations in these environments. When we think of vessel transfers, that high risk activity of transferring a technician from a crew transfer vessel onto a turbine platform, high-risk activity, we need safe systems to transfer that individual across. And also in relation to welfare arrangements. We don't see welfare particularly being a challenge on construction because that should be provided at the construction vessel, but more so at the operational phase. So when we move to an operational phase, where is the welfare going to be provided? Is there going to be welfare at the turbine, or is there going to be welfare provided at the crew transfer vessel? So developers need to think of these considerations right now as they're in the design stage and make sure that we've planned that there's adequate welfare available, particularly during maintenance or on faults on these wind farms. And then emergency preparedness. So again, there needs to be robust plans around rescue and evacuation. The Irish Coast Guard and Department of Transport recently published guidance in relation to offshore wind. So we would encourage developers to engage with the Coast Guard, particularly around emergency preparedness plans. So if we have an incident, that we have an adequate response in place. There are other considerations, of course, that apply both onshore and offshore, and there's particularly around electrical hazards, work at height. And I suppose work at height is one that continues to be a leading cause of fatalities in the construction sector. So we'd encourage the industry to continue to maintain high standards, particularly in the wind sector, for work at height activities. We're going to move on next slide. We're going to look at the construction regulations. So again, the construction regulations applies to our offshore wind because construction activity. It includes turbine foundations, turbine erection, cabling, substation work, and also the decommissioning work. So when we come to end the life of a turbine of a wind farm, decommissioning works, we come back into the construction regulations again apply, and therefore developers need to ensure that they're complying with the full requirements of the construction regulations. Here I'm just listing a few of the key duty holders because under the construction regulations, duties of the client, being the developer, is clearly set out. The client has a clear responsibility set out in the regulations to appoint competent persons to fulfill the role of a PSDP, which is the project supervisor design phase, having a really important role around developing that safety and health plan. The project supervisor of construction stage, when we enter that construction stage of the project, that person plays an important role in coordination. But importantly, if the client appoints these PSDP and PSCS, which they must appoint them, but they have to make sure they're competent to fill those roles. So the client has to ensure they've got a robust competency assessment in place when they're making these appointments. There's also clear duties set out in the regulations around designers, contractors, employees, and other persons at work. So just encouraging people to be familiar with what their role is on a construction project and ensure they're fulfilling their duties as set out in the regulations. So again, I suppose the emphasis of the construction regulations, and there's a real opportunity here for the designer and the PSDP, is when you're designing a project that as far as reasonably predictable, that we design out risk. So if there's a particular hazard, can it be designed out? If it can't be designed out, how are we going to manage that risk through the life cycle of a project? So again, construction regulations are really important, particularly as projects move in. Some are to the advanced design stage, but if we move into construction phase to ensure we're fully compliant with requirements. On the next slide, I suppose we're going to discuss some of the challenges. We're very aware of some of the challenges for the sector, particularly around the construction regs, and we continue to engage with the sector in relation to these. So around site survey work, so site survey work is exempt from the construction regulations. That's clearly called out in the regulations, but we're encouraging people to be familiar, distinguish between what is site survey work and what's more intrusive. So the general rule of thumb we're taking in the HSA that if it's geophysical surveys, so we're doing seabed mapping exercises, that can be classified as site survey work. But we're going to more intrusive, where we're coring seabeds, then that's when we're moving into the construction regulation that applies. So if there's any queries around this for the sector, then please get in touch with us. We'll happily provide any clarity that's needed. Then in relation to Safe Pass, we are acutely aware of challenges for the sector, and we continue to work with the sector and also at a cross-departmental level in relation to Safe Pass. We are fully aware that Safe Pass, as it currently exists, is not fully relevant to the offshore environment. So some maybe on the call may be familiar that Solus have recently launched a pilot maritime Safe Pass. So we're waiting the outcome of that pilot. But this challenge for the sector around Safe Pass is very much a live issue. So we continue to work with the sector and across departmental level to come to a solution in relation to a longer term solution in relation to Safe Pass. But the message here this morning I have to give to the phase one developers is that Safe Pass is a statutory requirement. So if you are doing construction work and you're bringing workers into more jurisdictions, they need to have a Safe Pass or an equivalent approved by Solus. That's the requirement right now, as is today. And we are looking for a longer term solution at a cross departmental level and with the industry. I should point out as well, though, there is an exemption, a subtle exemption within construction regs on Safe Pass. So if your worker is not residing in Ireland, is not normally working in Ireland, and are here for less than 20 days doing specialist work, such as electrical work, they are exempt from the requirements of Safe Pass. Now, I totally appreciate in the majority of cases that 20-day exemption will not sufficient duration, but that is there for any temporary works that are coming in for individuals, so just for people to be aware of it. Then the CSCS requirements, again, the CSCS requirements are set out in Schedule 5 of the construction regulations. And that basically, if anyone's carrying out a CSCS ticket requirement, then they need to have their CSCS, Solus CSCS card for that activity. Just to flag also, the CSCS framework is under review, and that legislation is currently being drafted by our colleagues in DEFRIS to replace the CSCS framework with a licensing framework. So that's currently a draft stage with the department in DEFRIS. And finally, before I hand back to you, Jay, I just want to touch on the general application regulations, because general application regulations are universally applied across all sectors, and general application regulations are structured focusing on specific hazards. So for example, work at height, which is of course very relevant to the offshore environment, and particularly relevant during the installation, maintenance, and during repair works or fault finding missions on those turbines. Fault from height, as I said, remains a leading cause of fatalities in the construction sector. So we have to ensure that the sector remains highly vigilant around work at height, and that the sector continues to apply high standards in relation to technicians working at height. Work equipment, again, very, very relevant to the offshore sector. So this includes lifting equipment. This also falls to your personal protective equipment for work at height to ensure the harnesses, lanyards, etc. are all checked and inspected and are tagged in advance of work being carried out. Electrical safety, again, particular part of the general apps covers electrical safety. So electrical safety procedures are really important, isolation procedures, and again, the importance of incompetent people carrying out the work. It really is a non-negotiable when it comes particularly to electrical works, like any other work activity being carried out. And again, PPE. But PPE is a fine line of defence. So we need to ensure that, consider the environment the PPE is being used at, and is it sufficient for the work being carried out. So that gives you an overview, Jay, of kind of the OSH framework in Ireland. I suppose a long response to a question around is there gaps, but we don't say gaps in the HSA. We say there's challenges for the sector, and we'll continue to engage with the sector across departmental level in relation to those challenges.
Thanks very much, Greg, for going through the application of the legal requirements to the offshore sector. It's kind of building on that slightly. So what is going to be the HSA's approach to offshore renewables? Is there likely to be much crossover or collaboration with the Marine Accidents Investigations Unit, for example?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. So I've just slide here just to give a bit of an overview of how we work. And I suppose this applies to any sector we work at. But I think the offshore wind sector, we've got a really positive forum for engaging with the wind sector here in Ireland. So we continue to engage with that sector through that forum with challenges. As I said, we continue to be here available to address any particular challenges for the sector. Also, we can provide guidance, so we will soon be publishing guidance in relation through FAQs on our website, particularly for the offshore sector, providing that clarity around to some of the challenges being raised by the sector. So that will soon go live on our website. And of course, inspection investigations are the bread and butter of our work within the HSA. So we will be doing target inspection of the offshore activities. I suppose offshore construction work is not new for the HSA. We are very involved in offshore construction projects. I suppose one of the most significant recent time construction projects offshore was decommissioning of the Kinsale gas field. Again, no specific regulations for decommissioning the Kinsale gas field. General OSH framework applied, and that project passed off successfully. So we will be doing target inspections of offshore wind projects, both construction and operation and maintenance phase. Investigations of serious accidents and fatalities. Hopefully, we will not see fatalities in the offshore wind sector, but if there's fatalities, the authority has a legal obligation to investigate all those fatalities and to hold people to account if there is breaches of regulations. And cross-agency, if I was come back to the initial question you posed around engaging with our colleagues in the Department of Transport, absolutely, we will engage with our colleagues in the Department of Transport, but very much so an investigation carried out by the HSA will be independent. We will do an independent investigation into a serious accident or a fatality, and then if there is a breach of legislation, initiate prosecution. So that's back to you, Jess.
Thanks very much, Greg, for that overview of the HSA's approach. And so moving on to an industry perspective now, and to yourself, Deirdre. So from an industry perspective, do you consider there to be any gaps in the legislation?
Thank you, Jay, and good morning, everybody. So from an industry point of view, while the framework of the 2005 Act applies to work activities in the Irish Territorial Seas, the problem that we face is the application of existing legal safety framework to offshore sector is complex, and in some areas it does not fit or transpose well into the offshore environment. Agreement on interpretation and application of the regs between industry and the regulators is required, and in some cases exemptions maybe for offshore. Moving on to the next slide, I can give some examples of maybe key topics, and Greg has already touched on the key ones, I suppose, and we are actively working and collaborating with the HSA on these topics. For example, the construction regs. In the wording of the construction regs, only one PSCS is permitted per project. Multiple PSCS is not permitted. But in the construction of an offshore wind farm, it's a complex projects or several projects rolled into one. The wording in the regulations, as I said, only allows for one. Or in the case where projects are truly independent of one another. In an offshore context, this is difficult to achieve as the elements of the projects do depend on each other for energization. So recent direct engagement with the HSA in the phase 1 project has been very helpful, and verbal indications for interface arrangements would be accepted, and there's, as Greg mentioned, the intention to publish these in upcoming FAQs on the HSA website. But I suppose the industry ask here is recognition of this in industry guidance or regulation. With regard to safe pass, the industry, I mean, Greg touched on it there, the content is not relevant, or in some cases not relevant for offshore, for the offshore environment and the offshore specific hazards that exist. And there has been a current pilot scheme of a maritime safe pass run by Solace, in which the phase 1 projects and other industry stakeholders have partook in that, and they have provided feedback. So the industry position there is that hate to say, and the regulators have recognised a significant existing offshore wind industry safety training. There is a significant level of internationally recognised safety training standards for workers in offshore. So yeah, that's one we're actively working with the HSA and Solace. So there's many stakeholders involved in that, between stakeholders and the various the parent companies and the government departments. With regards to general applications, welfare, so the welfare for operational wind farms, we need to know the legal requirements list. What will be the requirements? What will be the ask in the Irish sector in order for the developers to place commercial contracts for offshore wind structures like turbines and offshore platforms? And those requirements need to be known years in advance, because retrospective fitting of welfare, for example, is in the maritime space is complex. And that's just, I suppose, some examples to answer your question, Jay.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. And so linking to that, what do you consider to be the main industry concerns or questions that could be addressed to the HSA, some of the challenges?
Some of the challenges. Okay, if you can move to the next, that slide. So just before we get into that, there is a lot going on in the industry to prepare. And before we get into the detail of the concerns of the industry, this slide provides context and an overview of the phase 1 projects, 5 projects off the east coast of Ireland. As you can see there on the right-hand side, all five projects are in the planning system. As of 2025, targeting construction in 2029 to 30 is the construction timeframe there, and the phase 2, the Tunnua auction is due in the coming weeks in November 2025. As you can see, the projects over on the right-hand side there, who are the developers then in the Irish space? So you have the global leaders in offshore wind, in development, construction and operations of offshore wind farms who are already invested here in Ireland. You can see the developers' names there and the JV partners, and Dublin Array is the project that I work on, for example, a joint venture between RWE and Sergos Energy. These are the industry major players. They have proven expertise in many successful projects globally, including new market experience. They bring deep technical knowledge, know-how, resources and financial strength to grow Ireland's new offshore wind market. Sharing of lessons learned and best practices from leading global projects. And Ireland has the opportunity now to harness this experience to help to develop the Irish offshore wind industry to world-class standards. So in the next slide, please, it shows the main industry challenges. So the immaturity of the market in Ireland is a challenge. Industry and regulatory framework is not written for offshore wind. There's no specific health and safety guidelines and a lack of clarity for offshore. And some gaps in interagency collaboration, training, regulation and responsibility, industry training and skills gaps, emergency preparedness, and sufficient collaboration with industry.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. And so moving on from some of the main challenges, so how are developers currently preparing for offshore wind? How are they looking to address those challenges?
Okay, if you can move to the next slide, please. So the phase 1 projects through Wind Energy Ireland have working groups working hard to prepare for this. Working groups have been established across different elements of the phase 1 developments to tackle the key challenges. So working groups exist across legal, grid, operational, technical and health and safety work streams. The initial health and safety working group was set up going back as far as 2000, and a dedicated health and safety working group was set up in 2004 to focus on dedicated phase 1 project challenges. The phase 1 working group have been engaging with government departments and state agencies bilaterally, but progress has been challenging due to the multifaceted nature of the issues and the involvement of different bodies in each topic. So it became clear that greater interagency collaboration was needed. So recognising this need to bring the state agents and government departments together, the idea of preparing a national safety roadmap was born. And I think if you move to the next slide, Jay, it will just outline what our national roadmap is and what the intentions are. So the phase 1 projects are very excited to bring this idea to life through Wind Energy Ireland, have brought a consortium of industry international safety experts in to prepare this roadmap. You can see the industry experts there on the top. We have G+, through the Energy Institute, the Carbon Trust and Greensforge consultants, and they're actively working on this right now, and it's due completion at the end of the year. Currently, there's a desk-based review underway since September, and this is a review of all the health and safety and maritime legislation for offshore wind to benchmark it against international best practice, identify any gaps and misalignments, and to align Ireland's offshore wind with existing standards and best practice in the more established markets such as the UK and Europe. And the key stakeholders here are the state agencies and government departments, and they're invited to be part of the process and help to develop this roadmap through a workshop. We've already had an online briefing last week, and there's a workshop scheduled for next week. As I said, published by the end of the year, and the aim is to produce a strategic guide and implementation tool for the safety framework for Ireland's offshore wind industry. And the next slide, if you could just move to the next slide, please. Yeah, this just outlines escalation structures. As you can appreciate, there's significant engagement with governments on the delivery of the offshore wind targets for Ireland to achieve the commitments of delivering 5 gigawatts in offshore by 2030. Escalation channels have been set out to deal with any barriers to the phase 1 delivery. This slide shows the escalation from industry to the top of government to deal with any blockers. As you can see there at the industry level, the Health and Safety Phase 1 Working Group, where we sit, and then we feed up into the Phase 1 directors, and issues that are challenging to resolve at each level are referred up the chain, up to the Offshore Wind Delivery Task Force, and most recently the Clearinghouse there at the top of the chain. This was recently established in September 2025. This is high-level intervention from government to resolve any blockers. They meet quarterly, and the purpose is to accelerate offshore wind and to remove any systemic barriers. So it's really good for industry to have those frameworks and escalation channels in place.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. Very interesting to see the level of kind of collaboration across industry and also engagement with state bodies as well, and
Yes.
as part of kind of preparing for offshore wind. So Greg, just moving back to yourself then, and in relation to the inspection campaign, which was for onshore wind in 2023, what were the key outcomes from that campaign, and how might they be applied to offshore renewables?
Thanks, Jay. So yes, we carried out an inspection campaign 2023 across the green energy. So we looked at onshore wind, grid generation for solar, and we looked at anaerobic digestion. But today, look, I want to just focus on the onshore wind aspect of that campaign. And we found at the time of inspection a high level of compliance in relation to the OSH requirements. So there's acknowledgement to the sector, the high levels of compliance in terms of safety standards. But we did identify opportunities for improvement, and I suppose we're continuing to engage with the industry in relation to learnings from that campaign. Here, I've just listed the three main ones for us is around emergency plans. So those plans around rescue, particularly if we have a technician working in SL and we have an incident in SL, how we're going to get that individual out and the rescue plan for them. Welfare, as I mentioned for the offshore earlier, welfare is somewhat of a challenge for the onshore sector also, particularly where we are reliant on temporary welfare, which is adequate in some cases, but we're now encouraging the sector that particularly for large-scale wind farms, particularly which are particularly remote, that they look at designing in welfare at an early stage. So having permanent welfare facilities being constructed as part of the project. And I suppose to the industry, we're really posing the question that given the capital investment in an onshore wind farm, that the investment in permanent welfare is minimal with the overall cost of a project. So we're really encouraging that to be designed in at this stage. And again, traffic management, like many sectors, traffic management continues to be a challenge, and how we're managing that real high risk interface between pedestrians and vehicles, and the importance of that being managed, because we do know contact with machinery after work at height continues to be the second leading cause of fatalities in the construction sector. So this needs to be managed on the onshore wind environment also. So they're kind of the key three takeaways. And it was how we flip that to the onshore, to the offshore environment. I mentioned them earlier, particularly around the emergency plans, particularly working with the Coast Guard and engaging with the Coast Guard. It certainly isn't useful to engage with the Coast Guard when we've had an incident, because then we see a bit of frantic response where we're not very coordinated. So we're encouraging them to engage with the College and Department of Transport early and have those plans in place. And welfare, which Deirdre also touched on, the importance of welfare and how we're going to manage welfare, particularly during the operational phase. We don't see it being a particular challenge during the construction decommissioning phases. But in operation is how we're going to manage that. Are we going to manage it at turbine level? Or are we going to manage it at a crew transfer vessel level and bring technicians back off turbines for welfare? So that's it, Jay. That's back to you.
Thanks very much, Greg, for that kind of helpful overview of how those outcomes might actually also apply to offshore wind and the risks associated there. And so if we move on to guidance as well, and back to yourself, Deirdre. So how is international best practice guidance received in items such as that published by the UK's International Marine Contractors Association and the Global Offshore Wind Health and Safety Organisation, G+?
Okay, thanks, Jay. Yeah, so G Plus and IMCA, the International Maritime Contractors Association, are the go-to safety experts, industry experts for health safety in the offshore sector. The G Plus is safety organizations dedicated to improving safety in offshore wind, and it was established by 9 of the world's largest offshore wind developers and the major operators in partnership with the Energy Institute. RWE and other phase 1 projects are founding members of the G Plus, and as we've seen earlier, the Energy Institute are involved in preparing the roadmap for Ireland. In fact, the general manager of G Plus, Kate Harvey, is directly involved in preparing this roadmap. So you can see the key programs there on the slide for both IMCA and G Plus. I would say that both work of both, they complement each other, and they work jointly in partner to deliver best practice for industry. The IMCA are more in the maritime space. They are marine sector experts, and they're leading international trade organization, and they represent the maritime contracting sector. As you can see there, they have over 50 years of experience, and there's 800 members in 65 countries. They develop and they produce technical guidance, and they've over 500 documents in a technical library. Both produce like safety flashes and safety information. Going back to the G Plus, they have good practice guidelines, which are industry-led standards to improve health and safety standards in offshore wind, widely recognized and applied across the offshore sector. They produce incident safety statistics, collect and analyze global industry stats, and they have Safe by Design workshops, which focus on design and particular risk areas to improve safety design and reduce incidents in the sector. They also run a lot of learning from incidents, lessons learned, database and information sharing, which is widely used across the sector. And they have wind turbine safety rules, which are a model set of safety rules, safe systems of work to standardize safety protocols across the industry. And then IMCA, as I said, they're like a marine contractors, marine specialists. So they produce like safety flashes, and again, they collect incidents, anonymous as well, incident and near miss reporting across the maritime sector. They work together to deliver best practice, and they IMCA have a certification and accreditation programs as well. And global programs to meet, and they have technical seminars, and they work very much so in collaboration with industry. So yeah, so those are the go-to.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. So moving from international best practice to Irish guidance, and this question will be for yourself, David. So I understand that the Department of Transport and the Irish Coast Guard published guidance earlier this year in relation to offshore wind. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So yeah, that's correct. The government earlier this year published guidance for certain aspects of health and safety, primarily targeting the consenting of offshore wind. So they relate to health and safety matters that should be considered from the design stage, really, even though they will obviously apply throughout the entire life cycle of an offshore development. So there's 2 separate guidance documents, as you said, one by the Department of Transport and the other by the Irish Coast Guard, which actually sits within the Department of Transport. And as you can see on the slide there, the department's guidance is on safety navigation and emergency response for offshore renewables, and the Coast Guard's guidance, or it's a standard operating procedure, is the correct way to refer to it, I suppose. And and that's guidance and operational considerations for search and rescue and for emergency response for offshore. So it's important that those involved in the design stage of an offshore wind project are familiar with both guidance documents, as they prescribe the health and safety measures that should be built into the design of a project. The department has stated that the guidance must be used to evaluate all navigational risks and emergency response during the construction, operation, decommissioning of offshore wind farms. And the guidance must be used to assess potential changes to traffic patterns, and the guidance generally should be followed by developers to ensure a high standard of maritime safety in Irish waters. It's in fact a mandatory requirement for developers to demonstrate compliance with both sets of guidance documents, and this should be done in an application for consent. And essentially, the new guidance formalizes the existing practice that Irish developers have been doing anyway, which was relying on guidance published by the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. So the new Irish guidance is largely based on the UK guidance. It's also important to bear in mind that the Minister for Transport, the Irish Coast Guard, and the Commissioners for Irish Lights, they all have a remit in maritime navigational safety. So for that reason, they are prescribed bodies under the Planning and Development Maritime Development Regulations 2023. So this means that they can make submissions or observations to the Commission in relation to applications for planning permission for offshore wind farms. So that means that they'll be able to refer to the guidance when making submissions or observations on planning applications, and the Commission will have to take that into account, and the Commission might impose conditions requiring developers to comply with certain elements of the guidance as appropriate. So compliance with the guidance should be demonstrated in, for example, application documents such as an environmental impact assessment report would be one way. It should be used to evaluate, as I said, the navigational risks of a project. And that relates to siting of a project, to the construction phase, to matters that will arise during the operation and decommissioning of a project. Where any element of the project could cause a danger to the safety of navigation or indeed to emergency response. So the department's guidance includes, as I was saying, the navigational risk assessment methodology for the navigational risk assessment that I mentioned. And it guides developers on preparing navigational risk assessments and emergency response coordination plans. So some of the key issues that should be assessed in a navigational risk assessment include things like potential navigational or communications impacts, potential hazards to mariners and emergency response services using the site area and the general environs around the site, consequences of ships deviating from normal routes to avoid proposed sites, situations which could lead to safety of navigation being compromised, issues that could contribute to maritime casualty or lead to emergency operations out at sea or even along the coast, and other issues that could contribute to damage to the marine environment generally. So Annex 1 to the department's guidance, as I was saying, it sets out detailed methodology for preparing navigational risk assessments. And turning then to the Irish Coast Guard guidance, so as people are probably aware, the Irish Coast Guard provides search, rescue, emergency response, and pollution response services within Irish waters. And during the design and planning application stage for an offshore development, developers are required to use the Coast Guard's guidance to inform the layout, design, operation, emergency response, all safety management systems for offshore projects. So developers should discuss these with the Coast Guard at least 12 months before submitting an application for consent. And the principal criteria required by the Coast Guard guidance are linear layouts or grid formations for projects where possible, clear and unique identification markings visible to surface craft and aircraft, hover reference marking on wind blades, aviation obstacle lighting, lighting of wind turbines, rapid control and shutdown of turbines, where that might be needed. And yeah, I think that's that's the overview of the Coast Guard guidance. The Department of Transport does expect that all the guidance will be adhered to by developers. So it is important that people are familiar with them.
Thanks very much, David. And just moving to yourself, Deirdre, then in relation to the guidelines, are there any industry concerns with respect to safety, perhaps from a PDSP perspective?
Yeah, so thanks, Jay. Yeah, so in relation to this, while I'm not directly involved in this, I'm happy to speak to it. This is being led by the Consents Working Group in Wind Energy Ireland, one of the working groups I mentioned earlier, and it's very much a live topic on this latest guidance as the all 5 projects currently progress through the planning process with An Comisiún Pleanála. Some key points, I suppose, for future developments. In offshore wind, that international guidance and experience may not all be transferable directly into an Irish context in all circumstances, and needs careful consideration. Design implications, as you spoke of, David, the requirement, for example, of 2 nautical mile separation distance from every port and harbour on the Irish coast is a significant constraint for offshore wind development with regards to design. And the requirement to avoid recreational crafts and fishing grounds, how to practically imply this, and it's something that needs careful consideration. The SAR lanes, so the search and rescue lanes, maintaining 2 lines of orientation, and the overall design. This again has overall design implications for projects design and requirements influencing design, and therefore designer duties, as you mentioned, under the construction regulations. And many of the projects carry that duty, PSTP duty holder themselves. The requirement to supply a support vessel, a tug vessel, like the one you see in the photo there, and having a standby vessel to support for emergency situations at sea. This has been estimated cost of this by Wind Energy Ireland is over 35-year lifespan in the region of 150 to 200 million. So that's not an insignificant amount by any standards. So early engagement with statutory bodies is critical for any future developments in complying with the guidelines. And obviously the developers all remain committed to, are committed to, and are working with compliance with the regulations.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. And just going back to yourself, Greg, so what would likely be the HSA's main areas of concern if consulted by a developer in relation to proposed offshore renewable energy project in accordance with the guidelines?
Thanks, Jay. And I suppose Deirdre touched us a number of times around guidance and the international guidance there. But we're certainly willing to develop a guidance for the offshore wind sector if needed. And particularly here we have our Construction Safety Partial Advisory Committee. So for anyone who's not familiar with the Construction Safety Partial Advisory Committee, they're an advisory committee to the board of the HSA. And this year they published a new Construction Safety Action Plan. Under Goal 2 of that action plan, there is scope for us to develop guidance for the renewable energy sector. So it's quite a broad, what's included in Goal 2 is quite broad. So if there's an ask from the sector that we need to develop offshore specific guidance, we can certainly table this through our Construction Safety Partial Advisory Committee. And if that's approved and uptaken by the committee, then we can progress with guidance for the sector in terms of offshore. But certainly in the short term, we are going to make guidance in terms of FAQs available on our website, which hopefully we'll publish in the not distant future. So on our next slide, I suppose these are the key messages, Jay, I would give any developer in the offshore wind sector. And it's really about making those appointments of your PSTP, PSCIC, and make sure you appoint competent people to fill those roles. Training, there's a statute requirement in the construction regulations, acutely where again, this is a challenge for the sector, particularly around safe pass requirements. We touched on this, that Solas have piloted a maritime safe pass, we're waiting the outcome. But for now, the message for the sector is safe pass is a requirement or an equivalent course approved by Solas. So particularly for the phase 1 developers, you need to be planning for safe pass right now. There is no legislative amendment on the table right now. So safe pass is here and it needs to be complied with. And workers also need to be competent with the task being undertaken. Like any work activity, they need to be confident, make sure they have adequate training, knowledge, and experience to undertake the task they're carrying out. Task-specific risk assessment to implement control measures. So it comes back to RAMs, that we need a risk assessment as required under the Act, and we need meta statements for carrying out work safely. And then the inspection maintenance of work equipment. So this again comes back to your work at height, personal protective equipment, is our harness, is a lanyard, are our sliders, all being inspected, are they being maintained? And again, for lifting equipment, is it complying with the requirements and general application regulations? And then finally, which has been touched on a number of points, is around that emergency preparedness, that if we do have an incident on a site, time is critical. So we need to have an emergency plan that everyone is aware of, they know what they need to do, and all parties know how we can get that individual off or recovered if needed from the site. So they're the key takeaways. I suppose the 6 key messages. If that's anything that's left from my slides in terms of 6 key messages to them down, they're the main takeaways from most of the HSA. Thanks, Jay.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Greg. It's a very useful overview of the key takeaways there at the end. And if we might just stick with yourself, because we've got a few minutes left for questions. So one of the questions has come in, is there any definition of RAMs, so risk assessments and method statements under the regulations or the Act?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jay. So RAMS is a widely used term across the construction sector. So as you said, it's risk assessment and meta statements. So the Act, the 2005 Act requires risk assessments under Section 19 of the Act, but its definition for RAMS is not there. So what I've encouraged anyone, if you're not familiar with what a RAMS looks like, go take a look at our website. We have a RAMS template there. It's quite a basic template. It was not sufficiently broad to cover your offshore wind, but certainly a good starting point for anyone who's not familiar with what a RAMS looks like. Again, it's that risk assessment, identifying hazards, identifying the risk, and implementing control measures, and then how the work's going to be performed, and right down to the competence of the person going to do that work and the training requirement. So if you're not familiar, take a look at our website for the RAM template. I think if you find Google RAM template, HSA, it'll probably pull it up for you. Okay.
Thanks, Greg. And there's a question for yourself, Deirdre. What are the different elements involved in the construction of an offshore wind farm?
Sorry, my audio was off there. Yes, so for an offshore wind farm, there's like 7 mini projects within a project, if you like. So when you start with the onshore substation and then the onshore cables, transition joint bay to the offshore cables, then the array cables, foundation package, and the actual turbine itself. Oh, and did I miss an offshore platform? Maybe I did. So there's typically 7. So the 7 mini projects, and they're not that many either. They're quite comprehensive projects in their own right, all feeding into what is offshore wind farm construction.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. And yourself, Greg. I think so. There's a question you may have answered it earlier about whether there'll be any guidance from the HSA in relation to offshore wind.
Yeah, so as I said, Jay, we're going to publish FAQs on our website. In the longer term, if there's a need for additional OSH guidance beyond international guidance, then we're happy to provide that. So if the sector needs that guidance, then certainly they can table it, and we can table it to our Construction Safety Advisory Committee and commence that drafting of that guidance if needed. And of course, any guidance that we would develop, it would be in collaboration with the industry, and getting the industry involved at an early stage into drafting that guidance. Yeah,
Thanks so much, Greg. And there's a question. So this one would probably be for yourself, Deirdre. So Greg mentioned earlier some of the kind of key takeaways from his point of view. What about for yourself? What would be the key message?
I suppose in a nutshell, we're on a shared journey here with the industry and regulators, working together to deliver offshore wind for Ireland and to meet these ambitious targets. Keeping people safe at work is vital at every stage of the offshore wind life cycle, development, construction, operations, and eventual decommission. So by collaboration is key, and following proven international best practice, we can build a strong framework in Ireland without reinventing the wheel. So to harness that international best practice is a key message. Thus, by avoiding delays or creating barriers and costly downtime is critical. And just the phase 1 projects are committed to laying the right foundation for a safe and sustainable offshore sector in collaboration with the regulators.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. And maybe yourself as well, David. What would you say is the key message from your side?
Yeah, so look, I've discussed, the new 2025 Act for Marine Accident Investigations, and I've discussed the new guidance from the Department of Transport and the Irish Coast Guard. So I think my key message really would be that developers from a very early stage, from design stage, should be familiar with the guidance and what they require. And also when it comes closer to getting to commencing construction works, ensure that your contractors have all the appropriate certifications in place, and so that there won't be any delays to projects in that regard.
Thanks very much, David. So we can see we're just at the hour mark. So that brings to an end the today's webinar. Thanks everyone for joining. I can see there was a question at the end about whether slides can be shared. So that is possible. If you could let us know if you want copies of the slides. And also, just as mentioned at the start, if you could complete the survey if you in order to get your CPD for the session. Thanks very much, everyone.